web development. In today's lesson, lesson 8, we'll be concluding this module 2 with our core project. And keep in mind that this is a 2-part series where in lesson 7, we actually started with our core project. In this lesson, we'll actually be wrapping that project up. Now, let's have a look at the objectives for today's lesson. So in today's lesson, we really only have one objective, and that is essentially finalizing the HR system that we started developing in lesson 7, our previous lesson. And to do this, we actually have to complete the CSS code that we previously worked on in lesson 7. And then to wrap things up, we'll complete the entire system with JavaScript code, which is something we have to start from scratch with. Now, to recap, as a software developer working for Joe's Coaches, we were actually briefed by the CEO to develop an HR system for the company. And essentially, in our previous lesson, we were given a boilerplate for our HTML code, where we then actually started to partially develop our CSS code, which we will complete in this lesson, also so that we can complete our HR system. Great. Now, given that recap and review of our previous session, without further ado, let's dive in and code. Now, to kickstart the session, I'm actually going to start working on my accept button. And remember, this is part of the user interface of the interviews panel that we've built out. So I'm simply going to call accept -btn, stands for button. And then I'll start writing my code. So I'm going to give this button a width of auto, and the reason for this is because I want it to remain responsive. So as the user scales their client or their view, so will the button be scaled accordingly. I'll then give this a background color of, I've actually got a hex code over here, so I'll say 36BC65, and this is a green color. Next, I'll go and remove the border over here by simply specifying none as my parameter. And then the color of the text I'll create, and I'll make this white. Next, I'm going to add some padding, so we've got some spacing between the edges and the actual text inside of our button, and I'll go with 8 pixels as well as 12 pixels. Moving forward, I want to align the text so that it sits nicely centered inside of my button. By simply calling center on my text align attribute, I'll then move on to removing any sort of text decoration that I might have on the button. Because remember, we want to keep our UI clean, okay? Display is going to be my next attribute. And over here, I'm simply going to call inline block. Wonderful. The font size of the text is also going to be changed to 16 pixels. And then I will specify that my cursor needs to look like a pointer. And then lastly, I'm going to give this button a bit of margin. So I'll say margin, and I'll go 1%, I'll go 2%, 0%, and once again, 0%. Great. So save this up, and let's have a look at what our output looks like. So I'll navigate over here, refresh my page, and now our accept button looks a lot more cleaner now that it's been styled. So let's head back into Atom and actually work on our reject button. And I'll call my reject button over here, reject btn. Open up my curly braces. Once again, I'm going to give this a width of auto. And the reason for that is, again, because I need a responsive design. So I'll give this a background color of red. So I will actually, we don't need to give it a hashtag color with it. We can just simply go red. I'll give this a border style of none. Next, I'm going to call the color of my text to be white, because remember, I want my buttons to share similar attributes, such as the actual text color inside of the button. Next, I'm going to go and call padding once again. I'll say 8 pixels, and then I'll specify 12 pixels once again. Excellent. Moving on, I will align my text, and I will make sure my text is centered. Okay, text decoration. I'll actually specify this, and I will make this none. Display once again will be inline block. Great. So we are nearly there with completing our reject button. After this, I want to specify my font size to be 16 pixels. Once again, my cursor It needs to be a pointer. Let's actually just find this pointer. And then my margin is pretty much going to be the same as the accept button, with 1%, 2%, and 0% around the edges. Excellent. Let's save this up, head back over, and if we refresh this now, we have a red reject button with some great white looking text. Wonderful. This is coming together very, very nicely. You'll notice though our forms at the bottom over here, they are completely unstyled and they look extremely bland. Now these forms are supposed to be the modal forms, those pop-up forms. So let's actually get to work on this. Now the employee modal that I actually want to alter is this one over here. This is our first modal in our block of code, and I'm going to start styling this in CSS. So keep in mind that this is also an ID. So when I reference this, I need to use the hashtag symbol. Okay, so I'll say employee modal, which is this one over here, and then I can open up my parentheses and start styling. So I'll start with the text, and I will align this text to be centered in the modal. Then I will give this a width of roughly 30%. Next, I'll move on to the border style over here. And I will style this border to a solid style. After this, I'll actually increase the border width by simply manipulating the attribute. And I will give this a width of 2 pixels, up from 0 pixels. Next, I'll move on to the border radius to give it that rounded edges. And over here, to give it a clean design, I'm going to go with 10 pixels. Next, I'll work on the position. And I will make sure that this container has a position of absolute. I will set it with an offset of top 40%. And left, in the viewport, 40% as well. Then I'll actually change the background color to white. Excellent. So let's save this up and see what we have so far. So if I head back over to Chrome, refresh, and there we go. You'll notice that it's not initially hidden. This is something we're going to work on at a later stage, but at least it's coming together nicely. So let's head back over to Atom. And now we can actually work on the modal header. Here we just have one element that I want to work on. So I'll say modal dash header, open this up, and then I'll give this a border radius of 10 pixels all around. So I can actually just copy and paste this several times. And then close this off. But what I actually want to do is give it a value of 0 over here, else we could have just left it as 10 pixels. Great. Now we can actually move on to the content inside of our modal. So, or the header itself. So I'll say modal dash header dash content, and I will give this a font size of 20 pixels so that it stands out nicely from the rest of the content. I'll give this a padding value at the top of 20 pixels as well. Next, I'll move on to padding bottom and provide 20 pixels. And then lastly, I want to give this a font weight of bold so that it pops nicely. So let's actually see if there are any visual changes. So head back over to Chrome. I'll refresh this and things are spaced out slightly better. Excellent. So let's head back into Atom once again. Now I'm going to do some further styling to my modal header over here. So I'll actually just open up another modal header here. There's 2 ways to actually do this. You could actually just call the code at the top over here, but just that we remain experimental, I think we can actually just go ahead and create a second block file CSS. Again, this is not always the best way moving forward, but it's important to practice multiple ways of doing the same thing. So I will call background color, and I will set this to a hex color of 1B9 1DB and close it off. So I'll save this up. Let's head back over again, refresh, and we've got this beautiful blue color over here. So just to show you what I mean by trying different ways to do the same thing, I can actually just cut this out, Come back to the modal head over here. Just clean this up nicely. Delete this. Save. Fade back over to Chrome. Everything will still remain consistent. Excellent. Now we can actually go ahead and work on our confirm button. So let's dive right into that. So back over to Atom. Over here, I'm going to call my confirm button, which is an ID. So I'll say confirm btn. And then I'm going to give this a margin of 30 pixels. And I will float this to the right of its viewport. Okay, let's save this up. Head back over. Refresh. And our confirm button has been styled a bit better. Wonderful. So moving forward, we can now actually work on that name format class. Okay, so I'll say dot name dash format. Open this up. We'll give this a color of pretty much the same color we worked with previously, which is 1B91DB. I will add some further styling to my name format, and I will give this a font weight of bold as well. There we go. Next, I'm going to work on my input fields, which is going to give us a lot of different changes visually speaking. And I'm simply going to call input over here. Now you'll notice here, I'm not necessarily using a full stop or a hashtag because I'm targeting every single input field. So open up my parentheses. I will give this a width of 50% of its viewport. I'll provide some padding over here, 12 pixels, 20 pixels, and then I will move on to altering the margin. So margin 8 pixels and 0 pixels. Next, I will include the display and I will specify inline block. I will alter the border as well, 1 pixel. I will give it a value of solid. This is just a shorthand way of working on the border. So I'll say CC. C. Next, I will provide a border radius of 4 pixels. And then the box sizing, I will alter as well. And I will make this a border box. Excellent. Let's save this up and see how far we've gotten. Head back over to Chrome. Refresh. So this is starting to look a lot like our final product. Great. Now let's find our way back to Atom. And now I'm going to work on the confirm button. So again, I'll just perform some further styling on that confirm button that we had earlier, which is this button over here. So I will say hashtag confirm button. Open this up. And you'll notice I'm taking the same approach here that I did with one of our previous elements where I'm breaking out the styling into something separate. So I'll say width. I'll provide an auto value. The border, I will give this a value of none. Moving on, I will provide a color over here. And I will give this a color of white. Next, I'll move on to padding. And specify that my padding here be 8 pixels and 12 pixels respectively. I'll also align the text by calling align center. And then the text decoration, I actually just want to completely remove. So I'll say none. Then display. And I will once again call our favorite one over here, inline block. Our font size, I will specify as 16 pixels. Our cursor will be that of a pointer. And then lastly, our background color is going to be a hex value of 3, 6B, C, 65. Let's save this up. Hit back over, refresh. And now our confirm button has been styled as green over here. Excellent. So navigating back to Atom once again. Let's work on our interview modal. So this is a separate modal. Remember, our function or our system specifically has two different types of modals. One to add an employee and one to schedule an interview. So I'll be working on the interview modal here. I'll say interview modal, and then I will say text, align, center this. I'll give this a width, and I will specify 30% of the viewport. The border style, let's just get this right. The border style here is going to be solid as well. I want this to be uniform and remain consistent with the previous modal that we worked on. I will also give this a border width of 2 pixels. Next, I'll change the position to absolute, just like we did before. And maybe also add some border radius, that we have a round edge for our borders. Great. So after specifying absolute, I want this to be positioned the top at 40%. And I want this to be left at 40% as well. And then lastly, I'm going to give this a background color of white. Excellent. So let's save this up and refresh, and our second modal has appeared. Now you'll notice the second modal is overlaying the first modal, which is overlaying the entire UI. Again, this is something we'll alter at some stage to obviously hide these modals initially. Great. So let's navigate back to Atom. Now, I essentially have two things that I still need to style in my CSS, and that is the confirm interview button and then the two buttons outside of the modal UIs that allow you to bring up these actual modals. So I'm going to start off with the confirm interview button, and I will call the confirm button over here. Open up my parentheses and start styling. I'll give this a width of auto. I'll set the border equal to none. I'll give it a color of white, just so that we once again remain consistent with the previous modal that we created. I'll also add padding at 8 pixels, as well as 12 pixels. Next, I'll move on to text align and center this. And then once I'm done with that, I will remove any sort of text decoration we might have. After this, I will call display, and again, inline block, and set the font size over here equal to 16 pixels. Okay, I will ensure that my cursor is of pointer type, and then I will give this a background color of a specific hex code, and this hex code is going to be hashtag 36BC65. And then I will give this a margin of 30 pixels. And then lastly, I will float this to the right of the viewport. Great. So one more thing to do, and that is actually working on the buttons outside of the modal UI. So before we do any sort of refreshing, let's go ahead and actually do just that. So I will call the button, I will float it to the right hand side of the screen. I will give it a background color of, once again, hashtag 1B91DB. I will provide a width over here of something like 8%, should do just fine. I will remove any borders that I might have. I'll set this again to border none. I'll give this a color of white for the text. I'll provide some padding for these buttons, and here we'll go with a value of 12 pixels as well as 16 pixels respectively. I will align the text like we've been doing, and I'll provide center. Any text decoration should be set to none. My display is going to be set to inline block. Let's actually just correct this. Inline block. And my font size over here is going to be 16 pixels. And then to wrap things up, I'll set the cursor to pointer. And then lastly, I will give it a margin right value, not all the way, but simply just of 2%. Wonderful. So let's save this and see what our final output looks like for our CSS code so far. And these are the two buttons at the bottom that I was referring to. So if I refresh this, my button has been styled over here, my confirm interview button, and then I've got these two buttons over here that I've also styled. They use a class, and that's why I could actually just write one block of CSS code to target both of these buttons. Wonderful stuff. Now, completing our CSS section was quite code intensive. So if you are feeling a bit of code fatigue, I do suggest you take a break, stretch your legs, maybe get a cup of coffee or tea, whatever tickles your fancy, and we'll hop right back into it and complete our system with JavaScript. Great. Now, if you've decided to take a break, then welcome back. If not, we'll just keep going. Now, the first thing I need to do in order to hook up my JavaScript is to create a new file. So I'm simply going to call new file under the file tab over here. And then I'm going to save this immediately after I've created it. And I'm going to store this in a folder called JS. So I'll just rename this folder here and I will call this JS. Inside of this folder is where I'll actually save my JavaScript file. So I'll say main.js and I'll save that. So now this file will be treated as a JavaScript file. How do we know that? Because we are getting code highlighting at the top. So first of all, I need to create a couple of variables to hold some elements from my HTML code. So the first couple of variables I want to store is going to be my lists, my two lists specifically. And if we have a look at our HTML code over here, the interviews list is one of the lists we want to store because this is where we'll be appending new cards to. We also want to grab our employee list over here. And then we want to grab the modals that we worked with just a second ago in CSS. So I'm going to go ahead and create a variable over here. My first one is going to be employee. And I will call this employee list holder. And I will set this equal to document, because I need to grab the document, keep that in mind. And then I will call the query selector over here, query selector. And now I need to pass in a parameter. And that parameter here is going to be the employee list. So I need to pass it in as a string. And yeah, I will simply just say employee list. Let's actually, we don't get it on our pre-suggested item. So I'll have to call it from scratch. So I'll say employee dash list. Then on a new line, I'm going to create another variable to hold my interviews. So I'll say interview list holder, which is equal to document dot query selector. And once again, I'll pass in a string. And this one was simply just called interviews. Okay, so I'm grabbing my employee list and then I'm also grabbing my interview list. Now the next variable is going to have my add employee modal. Okay, and this is just going to store the modal so that I can actually hide it. So I'll say document, once again, dot query selector, open this up, and then I will pass in my employee. Let's see if we get it on our pre-suggested list. Yes, we do. Employee modal. This was an ID, therefore I'm using hashtag. And then the last variable I want to store is add interview modal. And I'll set this once again to document dot query selector. And if I'm not mistaken, this was an ID as well. So I'll go and call this interview modal. Great. So now we've stored all of those elements inside variables. The next thing I want to do, and this is quite important, remember we were unable to hide those modals because they actually showed up inside of our UI. Now I'm going to hide these using JavaScript, and this shouldn't be all that new to you. So I'm going to say the modal that we just stored in a variable, call the .style property on that, then call the .display, and set this equal to none. And this is the equivalent of writing this line of code out in CSS. I also want to call the add employee modal and do the exact same thing. I want to hide this dynamically using JavaScript. Display, I'll set this equal to, once again, none. Let's save that up and see what we have so far. So heading back over to Chrome, if I refresh this now, my modals are gone. So I actually managed to hide this. Instead of using CSS, I used JavaScript to dynamically hide this. So now it looks a lot cleaner. And at some point, we'll have to bring those modals back up when we click on these two buttons at the bottom. Excellent. So heading back over, I'm going to create a function over here that's actually going to allow me to add an employee. So I'm going to give this function a name that I can relate to, and I'm simply going to call this add employee. Let's actually first script out the keyword functions that we know we're actually writing a function over here. So I'll say add employee and then open up my expression block of code, and everything inside this block is what's going to happen. So first I'm going to create a variable called name, and this is going to hold the fields of my form. So if we have a look at our index again, then if we scroll down to employee list, we've got several parameters that we want to actually store. So let's just find this list, and this list should be at the bottom over here, which is employee modal. Now I want to store the name, the surname, the position, the department, and all these other fields. I want to store the data of whatever the user is going to pass into this input. I want to store it in a variable. Okay, and that is essentially what I'm going to do here. I'm going to hook up my form input fields to my variables associated with them. So I'll say document dot the good old query selector, and I will pass in the surname over here. Actually, the name came first, so I'll go name, and then I will call the value property. So what this is going to do, it's going to grab that input field, and whatever the value that was passed in by the user, that is what it's going to store in this name variable. And then I will create another variable for surname. I'll say surname, which is equal to document dot query selector. And over here, I'm going to pass in the string surname, and then I'm going to call the value on that. Likewise, I'm going to do the same for the position. So var position, which is equal to document.query selector. Open up my parentheses, pass in the string, and this is position. Also, don't forget your hashtag because it is an ID that you're calling, and the value. Then we have a couple more to do, which is department, email, as well as salary. So let's just go and do that. So I'll call department, which is equal to document.query selector. Open my parentheses with my quotation marks, and I will pass in department, which is an ID, dot value. Likewise, I also want to capture the user's email when I input them into the system. So email, which is equal to document dot query selector, and I will call the email via the ID dot value. Excellent. And we have one more to do, which is the salary for that user. So I'll say salary, which is equal to document dot query selector, and I want to pass in the salary over here. Let's just add the dot value in the meantime, and I'll go ahead and call salary with a hashtag. Great. Now the next part is going to be kind of tricky, so I just want you to bear with me. So what I need to do next is I essentially need to append these values to the list of the employees. Now, how exactly do we do that? Now, for the sake of demonstrating this next part, I am going to do a bit of copying and pasting, but bear with me because I will walk you through every step of the way. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new variable called var new item. And this variable is essentially going to hold HTML data that we are going to embed dynamically using JavaScript and not HTML the way we would normally do it. So I'm going to copy and paste the data now. And you'll notice I open up with a backtick over here. This key can be found on a Windows or workstation that generally runs a Windows OS preceding the number 1 key on your keyboard, which is this key over here. Simply hold down Shift and press this key to get the backtick in. So in this block of code over here, in this HTML block over here, essentially all I have is a list item that I am embedding inside of that list that I created earlier. Okay, the employment list. I've given it a class name of employee card, an ID of employee 1, and so on. And then I've included span tags over here that just allow us to embed data in a single line. And then lastly, I'm calling the default image over here to be embedded when I create this list item. This image is essentially this default image over here. And then moving on, you'll notice that I'm actually concatenating some variables over here, and I'm including this in my HTML code. Where am I grabbing this from? Well, you remember earlier we created these variables: name, surname, position, department, email, and salary. Well, whatever the user passed in here is going to be embedded in our code. Hence, we are concatenating it with our existing HTML code. Likewise, name, surname, up until salary. And you'll notice I've included backticks here as well. And my final backtick is the closing backtick for this block of HTML code. Wonderful. Now I actually need to go and write the code that allows me to add this to the view or the list itself visually. So let's go ahead and actually do that. But first, let's just close this off with my semicolon. And now I'm going to call my employee list holder into action because I want to start doing some work with it. And I'm going to call a method that we've never seen here before, which is called insert adjacent HTML. And this just simply allows us to insert an element in a specific position inside our HTML code. And this is going to add a new user after we submit the form directly after our last user in the user interface. This all makes sense when we actually have a look at how this performs. So then this takes in two parameters. I will call before end as my first parameter, because this is where I want to place this new element. And then I will call the new item that I want to pass. So what am I doing? I'm calling my list. I'm calling a method to insert this new element that I'm creating before the end, which is going to be at the end. And I'm passing it the new item, which is this code. I'm passing it this element into that list. Okay. And then I'm going to close this off. And then I'm going to say add employee modal dot style dot display, which is equal to none in this case. And all this does is it just hides that modal after I've submitted the new employee. Now you will notice that I haven't actually called the function dynamically in JavaScript using an event handler. Okay, in fact, I've actually called it inside my index.html file. And that is simply over here by calling the onClick method and calling the function that we just created. So if I hit back over to my main.js, this function is being called inside my index.html. Now let's actually have a look at the code, make sure everything is intact. So we've created a function at the top. And what you'll notice is that I actually do have a syntax issue here. I need to include my parentheses because this is a function after all, even though I'm not passing in any parameters. And then our data seems fine. We need to include a hashtag over here because this is an ID that we're calling of this field. I'll just save that up. My new item is pretty much straightforward. And then this is where I handle the adding of that card. Excellent. So before we go ahead and execute any code and run our system once again, I actually want to write one more function. And this is going to allow me to show the modal. So I'll call this function show add imp modal. Great. So then I'm going to, don't forget your parentheses. Okay. We do not want to make the same mistake again. And this is simply just going to call that modal, the add employee modal. And this is simply just going to show that modal. And we can do this by saying style dot display, which is equal to Instead of none, I'll call block over here and then close this off. So everything should work just fine. Again, this function is being called in my HTML code at the bottom over here by calling it on the onClick event. So I'll save this up. Now let's head back over to Chrome, refresh everything just to make sure all our elements are working just fine. So I'm going to click on add employee and this modal then pops up. So I'll fill all of this details out of here. Lucian Weingard. My position is going to be software developer. And the department I'll be working in is IT. And then I'll also include my email over here. I'll just give this a random email, test@test.com, test@test.com, and my salary is going to be 40,000. So once I click confirm, I can expect a new card to be added over here. So I'll click confirm, and voila, there you go. My new card with all the new employee details has been added. And you'll notice there is this default icon that I mentioned earlier that's also been added. The next thing we have to go and do now is we need to work on our upcoming interviews list over here. So let's navigate back to Atom and let's start working on this. Now the logic over here remains pretty much the same for the most part. I'm going to create a new function and I'm going to call this function add interview. And again, don't forget your parentheses. I'll open this up and I'm going to create a variable called department. Let's give it an interesting name, department interview. And this is going to equal document.query selector. And the value that I want to pass in here is the value that I'm going to grab from my form. And that is going to be hashtag. Let's open a string, hashtag. And this is going to be int dash department. This is just another field. Keep that in mind, int dash department. And then essentially I want to grab the value that the user passes in this form. And remember, this is all the data that I'm getting from my interview form. Okay. I'm going to create another variable over here called position interview is equal to document.query selector, pass in my string, and this is hashtag int dash position and the value of this. And then I'll create one more variable, which is var new interview over here. So remember when we had our backticks and the code that we copied and pasted earlier? Again, the logic remains the same for the most part. So I'm just going to copy and paste that data over here. And the same thing is going to happen as with our employee data. We are just going to dynamically create a list item. Let's actually just close this off correctly. And then we are going to concatenate that with the values that the user passes in here in this form. Where do I get this form from? Well, if we scroll up, that is essentially the ID here and the ID here and the elements associated with that IDs, which is my inputs. Okay. So heading back over to Atom. Now I actually need to work on the logic for inserting this. And again, for the most part, it's going to remain the same. So I will just open up a bit of space here and create interview list holder. I'm grabbing this so I can work with it, and I'm going to call it insert adjacent HTML again. And remember, this method actually takes in two parameters. In this case, I will go with before end, and the second parameter is going to be this item that I want to append over here, which is new interview. So I can actually just copy this and then paste this over here. Just clean this up. And then I'm going to call add interview modal dot style dot display equals none. And this just hides the modal after I've submitted it. Great. I need one more function, and that function over here is to show the modal. So function show int modal, and I'll just open my parentheses over here, add interview modal dot style dot display which is equal to block. And remember, this is the equivalent of working in CSS. So let's double check our code and make sure everything is worded correctly with no syntax issues. This seems just fine. I have a function over here. And just by the way, this function over here is being called over here. Okay, we are calling it through our HTML code. Now let's save this up, keep our fingers crossed, and hope everything works out just fine. So I'm going to refresh this. Now I will click the add interview button. My modal pops up, great. And I will call a department IT over here, or let's say logistics. And then maybe this upcoming interview is for a new driver that we want to hire for the company. And let's just make sure it's not available in my interviews. Once I click confirm, that then gets added and looks exactly like the other list items over here. Wonderful. And that brings us to the end of this tutorial. Now, there is obviously a lot more that you can actually do here. For example, you could actually add an employer, add an interview, and then pass that to the back end and store it on a database. But of course, that is beyond the scope of this course. Now, with that being said, I do encourage you to customize this platform however you would actually like to, and you could even show it off to your friends and employees just to show them what you've actually worked on and how you've developed your own HR system. Now, just before we officially close off this practical session, I do have a challenge for you, and I want you to consider improving the HR system by adding functionality that allows you to close the modals. Now, what exactly do I mean by this? So if you consider the platform we've built, by clicking on either of these buttons, we generally get the modal that we worked on. But there's an issue here. We can only confirm, we cannot close this modal down, which is a bit of an issue because the only way to get around this is to actually refresh the browser. And that can be quite annoying, especially from a user experience point of view. The same applies for adding an interview. We can only confirm and add an interview. So essentially, what the challenge implies is that you should be able to either add a X over here at the top, or maybe even a button that says cancel. And by clicking that button, this closes down the modal and returns to the main UI, which is the dashboard. And that is my challenge to you. Now, before I leave you with this challenge, here is just a small tiny hint. You should consider creating a function that uses the style.display attribute. Okay, in JavaScript, of course. And then, of course, you can embed the element as you wish. That can be an X sign over here, or it could be a button. This is entirely up to you. Now, just a quick update, and for some exciting news before I wrap up the session, I will be taking a break from web development for the time being, at least before I get started with Module 3 again. In actual fact, I'll be moving on to mobile application development, which is going to be really, really exciting and something I'm looking forward to. The technologies I'm actually going to be using in this course is Flutter, as well as Android Studio and Dart. And these are really exciting technologies in the mobile application development space, especially because you can build cross-platform or mobile applications. So that basically implies that you can actually build iOS applications as well as Android Studio applications using a single code base. Now, with that being said, rest assured I will be coming back to web development, and at some point I will be updating Module 3 as well as Module 4. So for those of you who are really keen on getting your hands dirty with mobile application development, I do suggest you keep an eye out for my upcoming course.